part 2 of my lesson on the modes, I briefly touched on the arpeggios and adding those to the modes for more color and taste in your solos and improvisation. So it seemed only fitting to do a companion video to that which focused on the arpeggios alone. Okay? What an arpeggio is it's the individual notes of a chord being played in succession, usually from low to high. You can actually mix up the notes any way you like, and it's still technically an arpeggio. And you'll find that in a lot of really popular songs, right? And so on and so forth. So if we look at a basic chord like a simple A minor, the chord is actually made up of just 3 notes from the scale that it comes from. It's an A minor chord, so it comes from an A minor scale, which is played like so. And the notes in the scale are A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then back to A, the octave to the root note. And then it just repeats in an octave from there. So an A minor chord is made up of the first, the third, and the fifth notes from the scale. Most chords start with that. A C major chord would be made up of the first, the third, and the fifth of the C major scale. But we're dealing with an A minor chord right now, so if we count up the scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we want the first note, the third note, and the fifth note. Those 3 notes make up an A minor chord. And if we look at an A minor chord, the notes may not be played exactly in that order, first, third, and then fifth, but those are the 3 notes that make up the chord. It starts with an A note, followed by an E, which is the fifth, another A note, which is just the octave to the first one. Finally, C happens right here, and then the last note is E again. So it has the 3 notes that we need to make up the chord. But when guitar players use arpeggios in their soloing, when they use them to improvise or whatever, they play the notes individually, and they are usually played in the order that they fall in the scale. So they follow the pattern, first, third, fifth, and then you can continue into the octave. And so forth and so on. So the first thing I'm going to do in this lesson is map out the basic minor and major arpeggios, and then we'll talk about more advanced arpeggios that you might find in jazz or fusion or just more advanced stuff, you know, Satriani, Steve Vai, all that stuff. So I'm going to be in the key of A minor, and I'm going to start with the A minor arpeggio. It starts at the 5th fret, then to the 8th, then using your first finger, 7, 7, then 8, then 9, then 10, then 8, and 12. Okay, and I'm going to add to this another arpeggio, a major arpeggio that's found in this key, which is F major, and I'm choosing that one because it's a great fingering that you can move up and down the neck. In fact, you can move all of these fingerings up and down the neck. I played an A minor arpeggio starting at the 5th fret, but you could play a G minor starting at the 3rd fret. The fingering, the pattern, the shape would be exactly the same. So I'm going to use an F major arpeggio starting at the 1st fret, okay? Both of those shapes, the minor and the major, can be moved up and down the neck, and they can be applied to the chords in a progression. If you're moving from a A minor chord to an F major chord, you can play those arpeggios against the changes, and they sound really, really good. But when you add the seventh to each chord, instead of it just being an A minor chord, when it becomes an A minor seventh, you're adding an extra tone in there. You're adding a G note to the mix, and that completely changes, in my mind, the sound of the arpeggio and makes it a little bit more interesting to listen to and incorporate into your playing. So in any given key, there's going to be a set of 7 arpeggios, okay? And the arpeggios sound really great when you add that seventh to each one. So if I'm in the key of A minor, the chord progression is going to be A minor, B diminished, C major, D minor, E minor, F, G, and then back to A minor, which was covered in part 2 of my video on the modes. But by altering each chord and adding a seventh to it, things get a little bit more modern and progressive sounding, a little jazzy, you know. But plenty of modern rock players have dipped into this stuff. I mean, even Jimmy Page, I mean, he used a lot of jazz chords in several Led Zeppelin songs. So by adding the seventh to each chord, it becomes a little bit more interesting sounding. So I'm going to do A minor seventh, and instead of B diminished, I'm going to do the B minor seventh flat 5, which is sort of the jazz version of that chord. And that'll be followed by a C major seventh, a D minor seventh, and E minor seventh. You probably get the idea. So for each one of those chords, there's an arpeggio that goes with it. So I'm just going to map out those arpeggios. And they're great to add into your music. Obviously, they sound best or good, you know, when you play them against the appropriate chord. But they also can create great harmony. You know, if you have an F major seventh chord and you happen to play a D minor seventh arpeggio against it, it can actually sound really cool. So let me just rumble through these, okay? So the first chord in the scale, the key of A minor, is the A minor seventh. And that is the arpeggio that I mapped out just a little bit ago. The second chord in line is the B minor seventh flat 5. And the arpeggio is like this. The third chord in line is the C major seventh. And there's 2 different ways to play this arpeggio. My first fingering of choice is right here. And there's a second fingering that I think is really effective. That's right here. The fourth chord in the key is D minor seventh. And the arpeggio is like so. The fifth chord is E minor seventh, and the arpeggio is exactly the same as the D minor seventh, just starting on an E note, of course. The next chord is an F major seventh, whichever fingering you like, And I'm using for this the exact same fingering that I used for the C major 7th down here. The 7th chord in the key is G7, G dominant 7th, and the arpeggio is played like this. You can play it an octave higher as well. So those are all four, I guess what you would call jazz-flavored arpeggios that you can add to your playing. Now, of course, what we covered at the beginning of the lesson was the basic just major and minor arpeggios. Those sound great too, but I think that adding the 7th in there is really nice. It really adds a lot of color, and it's very modern sounding. These are great things to practice. They're good for your playing, good for your technique, left and right hand. And they sound pretty sweet, you know, and you can mix them up a lot. So I hope you've enjoyed the lesson, and I hope you can find a place in your head, heart, and soul for these. And if you get a chance, if you get a moment, please take a second to subscribe. And as always, I will get more stuff up and running. Thanks.